Hi, and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Sandy Allnock. I'm an artist. I work in a lot of different mediums, in a lot of different styles and subjects, and just everything. I do a little of it all. And if you're that kind of person, you're my people. So come join me here and subscribe to the channel. The two projects that I'm going to share are both ocean paintings because recently I asked you what you'd like to see, and so many of you said water. So I am going to be doing a smaller project that I'm going to turn into bookmarks, and then a bigger painting that I'm not going to narrate. It's going to be the same technique as used in the smaller painting, but just with more detail, more layers and all that kind of thing. Even if you don't want to watch that whole thing because it's a little on the long side, if you could just leave it running in a tab in the background, just hit the mute button. It helps the channel out to get that much watch time. So, okay, let's get started, shall we? For my paintings, I'm going to be using my typical watercolors in my House of Hoffman palette, and this is all paints by Daniel Smith. And this is my World Watercolor Month swag. So there's a zipper pouch as well as a mug if you're interested in getting that. That's also fundraising for the International Child Art Foundation. So there's a link in the doobly-doo for that and all the supplies. Now this is a brush that I want to introduce you to. It's not super expensive. It's an Escoda, and it's a Joseph Zukovic. I can't say his name. Joseph Z. It's a brush by him, and it is lovely. It is a number 16 mop, and it looks like it's giant, and it is, but it is lovely enough to do some smaller work. So I'm going to use it for most of the painting. When it's wet, you can see it does get a fairly decent point. It's not a tiny point, but it's a pretty decent point, depending on the size of the painting you're working on. And this first one is a small ocean painting, and it is based on a photo like this one, except I didn't necessarily look exactly at the photo. I'm going to show you a simplified way to paint it, because there's a lot of waves in here. And in the larger painting, in the latter portion of this video, you'll see a much bigger ocean painting and lots more of that detail added in many layers. So this is basically the much simpler version. The color mixture here is yellow ochre plus some transparent red oxide, or you could use some burnt sienna, and dropping in just a tiny bit of French ultramarine blue so it dulls it down just a tidge, and then a thicker mix, slightly thicker, to drop into all this wet paint right along the water line and let that just run up into everything else. This big brush uses a lot of paint and a lot of water, which I find is the thing that most of us, when we're learning, don't use enough of. We just don't have any idea, like, oh my gosh, how much paint, how much water? Oh, you mean that much? That was one of my big eye-opening things when I first started painting. For the smaller detail around the edge of the water, I'm using a number 2 synthetic brush just to get some detail in there, because when the bubbles come on shore, they don't tend to be just one giant shape. Even though we might see it as one, there's just a lot of little bubble detail in there that might be helpful on a painting like this, so you can scale it to what you need. But notice there's a big white spot up there. That is from the water that's sitting on the edge of the tape. And if you're using cheap tape, often that won't, like just wiping it off that way, that won't really work. But on this white tape that I use, it's linked in the supplies, you can wipe it off really nicely. And once you do your second paint through of that wet section, then everything will be fine going right up to the edge. But you do need to watch that as you start working on your paintings to make sure that you don't end up with like weird white gaps around the outside. So I'm drying it completely so that I can add some texture to it. Now you can add texture by using some kind of paint that has granulation in it, or you can do what I'm going to do, which is to take some of that excess paint and paint it onto a toothbrush and then just flick it with my finger. And painting it on there sometimes works, sometimes just dipping the whole brush into whatever the leftover paint is. You just have to have enough. And the amount of water, the amount of stiffness of your toothbrush, a lot of different factors will matter. But if you get any spray over on the water, no problem. Just wipe that off with a baby wipe or paper towel or something. That will lift off quite nicely. For the water, I'm using a mixture of some turquoise with just a little dollop of French ultramarine dropped in to make it a little bit bluer, because all of that water that's closer to shore is more of a turquoise color. And what makes it turquoise? Well, I don't know this scientifically, but my guess is that sand has a yellow tint to it and the water has a blue tint to it. And when the water is really thin, it's going to show some of that color from underneath through to the top of the water. So I'm using my brush to add just a little bit of detail into the top edges, and watch the bottom edge. Don't let that dry. So if you're going to, do that little fussy bits at the top, make sure the bottom stays nice and wet, because for the rest of the water, we want everything to just keep moving. And if that edge dries, you're going to get a weird hard line across the whole thing. So I'm going to add in a thicker mixture of the turquoise so that at the top I have a lighter section, and then it's going to go down into darker, and then just keep painting. I put a roll of tape underneath of my board to give it a tilt, which means gravity is going to help me to get that paint moving as it moves down the water out into the deeper section of the ocean. The colors I'm mixing in my palette now with that French Ultramarine Blue in there, those colors are all going to be the same thickness as the last one, maybe a little bit thicker as I work my way down the water. So if you start putting in lighter colors right now, if you put in thinner paint, it's going to bloom and blossom. And we don't want blooms and blossoms. We want it to just get richer and darker toward the bottom. So I've added in some Prussian Blue down here in the lower section, and just keep adding in darker and darker colors. Now, what do you do when you don't have a really dark blue? You can take whatever blues you do have and put in something like a Paynes blue gray to darken it, or use just whatever colors in your palette are going to make that blue a deeper one. So I've got Paynes blue gray. I'm going to put some more Prussian blue in it to make sure it still feels very blue, but it's going to get much thicker. Look how thick that is compared to everything else. And as long as everything else is still soaky wet, and we want this soaky wet, not puddly wet, but very, very wet. If it starts to dry, take a spray bottle and spritz it to make sure everything keeps moving. And when it's got this tilt, you're going to start getting, see those little fingers that are appearing as the paint is kind of washing down the page? Then you can go back in and paint more color back up into the more shallow portions of the water and create all of the intricacies that you want in that water as it's spilling out to sea. If you want to, work back up with your lighter blues, you can do that. You can spray things and just keep that moving until you're happy with it. And, if you have spots that appear, because I do have one place where I'm going to end up with a little goober, and you can always go over some areas with another layer, which I will end up doing. I'm just dropping in more and more color and enjoying the way that the paint moves across. Some areas are going to be more blue, some areas more turquoise, just playing around back and forth with all the colors as long as they get deeper and darker in the deeper part of the ocean. Because that shelf up at the top edge, which is where it's not as deep, that's where you're going to get more of that turquoise color. And I shouldn't say always, just because depending on the photograph and how it was taken and what the shelf of the coastline looks like, you may get different things. But when you're looking at a reference for something like this, like the picture I showed you, there's a link in the doobly-doo if you want to go use that picture for inspiration. You may get different colors in there and different kinds of shapes, depending on how the waves are breaking on shore. But I'm wiping off the tape to make sure that I don't get any of that kind of strange pull away. When you're using cheaper tapes, just pulling off that excess color doesn't often work to get the color to go all the way out to the edge. That's why I use this other tape. This also peels off really nicely from my paper. So I'm going to dry that up, and you can see there is a little spot, kind of bottom middle, where I have a little bloom. It's where one place dried faster than others. I'm going to be able to fix that, so no worries. And then up here at the top section, I'm using a baby wipe to soften up, to lift some of these areas so that I get more of that soft, kind of cascading onto the beach kind of whiteness. So you can lighten up an area like that and then fully dry it so that if you do any painting in that area, you're not working with a wet piece of paper there. So now I'm going to mix up some dark color and start putting in more layers in the ocean, because in that photo you saw there's a whole lot of like hard edge detail in some places and washy details in other places. I needed to fix that spot out there deep in the ocean where I ended up with that small place that dried too fast. So I'm just going to start adding in some sort of scrubby types of water sections in here. Now you can decide if you want to soften some of those edges, just use a baby wipe to lift some of that up, or if you want to leave that a little bit harder edged. And when you see the larger painting in the latter portion of this video, you'll see me do a lot of back and forth and putting in gobs of detail into this interim section. But you can, for something small like this, you can just decide how much of that you want to include in your painting, or whether you just want to let it go as is. So dry this sucker up again and see if I ended up creating any other weird areas, because every time you dry something, you can have problems. The thinner your paint is, the less problems you'll have, but that doesn't allow you to get to those really deep darks out in the ocean. And when it comes to a painting like this, the darker the ocean is, the whiter that top portion will feel. I'm switching to a silver point brush. It's not as big as my big brush, the Escoda brush that I showed you. And this one is around the same price, but it's a smaller brush, so it's going to give me a little finer details. In the large painting, I'll use just the Escoda for, I think, pretty much everything. I don't think I used any other brush for that one. So I got all this fine detail there with the Escoda brush. But for this smaller one, I wanted a slightly smaller brush. And this one will be linked in the supplies as well. And I'm just going to paint with very, very thin pigment. This is like that same initial turquoisey blue color that I started with. And I'm using it in such thin fashion that when I dab it with a baby wipe, then I get that detail, but I get it with just pale colors. So I don't want a whole lot of dark color up here, but sometimes it's hard to see what you're doing or that sort of thing. It's much easier to put that color in and then just lift it off before it's dry so that you can get those areas that are a little bit darker and, get some more of the wave detail up there. And you can do this in many, many layers. Paint over this and dry it and then paint over it again with more. Really depends on how much you want to get into all the fine details of the wave. Now, before anyone wonders whether or not this page was crying while I cut it, it was not, because it knew it was going to be made into beautiful bookmarks, and I cut them to fit these sleeves. I will link the sleeves that I'm using here in the doobly-doo, because they fit the project that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. And you could write something on the back. You can put a sentiment on the front. I did find this one in an old stamp set from Colorado Craft Company. They don't seem to make it any longer, but it is a lovely one. To the world, you may just be one person, but to one person, you may be the world. And it's this stamp set if you have it. So bookmarks are done. And now I turn you over to the larger painting of the ocean, and you can either watch it and enjoy, or just put it on that tab in the background. Let it run so that YouTube clocks all that time for my channel, because it really helps to get my videos out to more people when it looks like people stick around for a long video. Thank you so much.